The only thing colder than the mountain wind was the look on her father's face. The wagon wheels screamed against the frozen ground, a sound like a dying animal. Each jolt sent a spike of pain through Mara Ellison's bones, a brutal reminder of her new reality. She sat hunched in the back, her arms wrapped tight around her belly, trying to shield the tiny life inside from the harshness of the world, and from the harshness of her own father. His face was a mask of stone, hidden under the brim of a weathered hat. He hadn't said a word in hours, not since she'd begged him, pleaded with him, to just let her explain. But her words were useless, lost to the wind that sliced through her thin wool dress. His silence was 1,000 times worse than his rage. His silence meant the decision was final. It meant there was no coming back from this. Just a month ago, her world was sunshine and hayfields. She'd been dreaming of a future with Calvin Hargrove, the golden boy with a smile that promised forever. His words were sugar, his promises honey. But now she knew. She knew how quickly sweetness could turn to rot. Her father's voice finally shattered the silence, sharp and cruel as a whip. "You'll not rot my house with your shame." He didn't even look at her. His knuckles were white on the reins. Mara's throat closed up. "Papa, please. It was Calvin's. Don't say his name!" The shout made the old mare stumble on a patch of ice. He spat over the side of the wagon, his face contorted with fury. "Hargrove's boy wouldn't look twice at you now, and I won't have this town whispering that Ellison's got a harlot for a daughter." The word hung in the air, a poisoned dart. She trembled, but the tears wouldn't come. They were frozen inside her, just like everything else. Her father had made his choice, and she was not part of it. The wagon groaned to a halt. They were on a high ridge where the trail seemed to simply vanish into a wall of white. Ahead, almost swallowed by the dark, looming pines, stood a rough cabin. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney, a lonely ghost against the slate-gray sky. Her father climbed down, his boots crunching in the snow. He untied a sack of feed from the wagon bed. Then he turned, his eyes empty of all fatherly affection, and reached for her arm. "Get out," he said. The words were flat, final. Mara couldn't move. Her legs were numb, her hands stiff with cold. Where are we?" "Doesn't matter," he grunted, yanking her down from the wagon. She stumbled, nearly falling onto the icy ground. "You won't be coming home." Her breath hitched as she saw the cabin door creak open. A man filled the doorway. He was a giant, a figure forged from the mountain itself, draped in a thick wolf pelt. His dark beard was dusted with frost, and his eyes, shadowed beneath a heavy brow, flickered from her father to her. He said nothing. "Crowell!" her father barked, shoving her forward. "Here's the girl. Take her." The man, Silas Crowell, remained silent. He just stepped aside, letting the warm, flickering light from inside spill out onto the snow. His silence was a terrifying void. It was more unnerving than any threat. Her father pushed her again, harder this time. "She can cook, or whatever else you need, I don't care. She's not setting foot on my land again." A single, broken sob escaped Mara's lips. "Papa, please, please don't leave me." He was already turning away. He tossed the sack of feed onto the porch. It landed with a soft thud. Payment. For his own daughter. He climbed back onto the wagon, slapped the reins, and didn't look back. The wagon lurched forward, swallowed by the winding trail and the swirling snow. The sound of the wheels, the sound of her entire life disappearing, faded into the oppressive silence of the wilderness. And Mara was left standing there, trembling, alone, abandoned to the mountain and the silent man who now owned her. She looked at the man, Silas, expecting him to speak, to order her, to do something. But he just gave a curt nod toward the open door and then vanished around the side of the cabin without a single word. The wind howled, whipping snowflakes against her frozen cheeks. It was as if the mountain itself was screaming. She hesitated on the threshold. Was this a prison? A cage? Inside, a fire crackled in a stone hearth. The air smelled of pine smoke and something savory, maybe rabbit stew. A rough wooden table stood in the center, its surface scarred with decades of knife marks. Furs hung from pegs on the walls. In the corner, a single cot. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a home. She stepped inside, the wind nudging the heavy door shut behind her with a hollow, final thud. She sank down near the hearth, letting the heat lick at her frozen skin. A log in the fire popped and broke apart with a sharp hiss. It was the sound of her own heart breaking. She pressed her palms to her belly, to the faint, tender swell that held the cause of all this ruin. Her father hadn't even asked. He didn't care who the father was. He just saw shame, a stain to be scrubbed away. Suddenly, she heard heavy boots crunching in the snow just outside. The door opened, and Silas's shadow stretched long across the floor. He carried 2 dead rabbits in one hand, their fur matted with frost. In his other hand, he held a long, wicked-looking hunting knife. His gaze slid over her for a second, completely unreadable, before he set to work. He began skinning the rabbits with a quiet, brutal efficiency. The only sound in the cabin was the sharp, rhythmic scrape of steel against bone. Mara swallowed, her throat dry. She had to know. What's your name?" she managed to ask, her voice a wavering whisper. "Silas," he said. The word was low and gravelly, like stones rolling downhill. She waited, but that was it. Nothing more came. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the fear making her voice shake. He paused his work, his dark eyes lifting just enough to meet hers across the dim, firelit room. The look in them sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Didn't ask for you," he muttered, and turned back to his task. The words hit her like a physical blow. "Didn't ask for you." She was a piece of property, unwanted cargo. Her own father had traded her for a bag of grain, and this man, this stranger, didn't even want the prize. Hot, angry tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry in front of him. She turned her back to him, facing the fire, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. That night she curled up on the hard wooden floor, her hands cradling her belly. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws. She could feel Silas's presence behind her, a huge, immovable mountain of a man, silent and unknowable. Outside, the wind screamed its rage across the ridge, but inside, Mara whispered to the tiny, fragile life growing inside her. It was the only piece of hope she had left in the entire world. And as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she couldn't shake the terrifying question that echoed in the silence. What kind of man lived alone in a place like this? And what, exactly, did he plan to do with her? The first light of dawn was a thin gray knife, slicing through the gaps in the cabin's shutters. Mara woke on the hard floor, her entire body aching. For a split second, she didn't know where she was. Then the cold, the smell of pine smoke, and the crushing weight of her reality came crashing back down. Silas was already up. He moved with a strange, quiet efficiency, stacking freshly chopped wood by the hearth. The rhythm of his work was steady, almost mechanical, the movements of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of being alone. He didn't look at her, but his voice cut through the morning chill. "Water in the pot. Wash up." It was gravelly, rough from disuse, but there was no malice in it. It was just a statement of fact. She pushed herself up, her body protesting every move. She sat by the fire, rubbing her arms, her mind replaying the image of her father's wagon disappearing into the snow. The emptiness he'd left behind was a physical weight, heavier than any winter storm. She saw a wooden bowl and a knife left on the table. Beside them lay the rabbits from last night, skinned and cleaned. It wasn't an offer. It was an order, an expectation. You are here. You will work. The problem was, Mara couldn't cook. Her mother had handled the hearth, and her father had never allowed her near it. "You'll only ruin things," he'd always barked. Her attempts were clumsy, the knife feeling foreign and dangerous in her hand. She hacked at the meat, making a mess of it, feeling his silent judgment from across the room. Just as her frustration was about to boil over, a gust of cold air announced his return from outside. He shook the snow from his pelt coat, his eyes catching hers for a fraction of a second. "You ever cooked before?" he asked. The question wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "A little," she lied, heat rising in her cheeks. A low sigh escaped him, a sound that was more weary than unkind. "Not like that," he muttered. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. His hand brushed against hers as he reached for the knife, adjusting her grip. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through her. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly careful. He showed her how to slice cleanly, how to find the joints. His instructions were sparse, just a few grunted words, but she followed them, her focus absolute. She could not appear useless. She could not give him a reason to cast her out like her father did. As the stew finally began to simmer, filling the small cabin with a rich, savory smell, she watched him work. He'd taken a piece of wood and was carving it with his hunting knife. The steady scrape, scrape, scrape of the blade was the only sound. She was desperate to ask him a million questions. Why did he live here? Did he have family? What had happened to make him this way? But the hard line of his jaw, the sheer wall of his silence, warned her away. Her belly gave a sudden, sharp kick, a tiny flutter that was both a comfort and a terrifying reminder. She shifted uncomfortably, and Silas glanced up from his carving. "You're far along?" he asked. The question was so direct it startled her. 5 months, she said, her voice small. Maybe closer to 6. He just nodded once, his face unreadable, but she saw his gaze linger on the curve of her stomach for just a second too long. There was no disgust, no judgment like she'd seen in her father's eyes. There was just something she couldn't name. After they ate in silence, he pulled on his coat and grabbed his rifle from the pegs above the door. "I'll be out till dusk," he said, his back to her. "Stay inside. Wolves roam close this time of year." The words sent a fresh wave of fear through her. What? What am I supposed to do? "Keep the fire alive," he said, and then he was gone. The door closed, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the vast, silent woods. The cabin suddenly felt huge, the quiet pressing in on her. She walked the small space, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the table, the rough-hewn walls. His life was laid bare here. A few tools, some furs, a kettle, a single tin cup. The life of a man who needed nothing and no one. As dusk began to settle, casting long, spooky shadows through the trees, a primal fear gripped her. What if he didn't come back? What if he was just the first part of her punishment, and the wilderness was the second? The sound of boots on the porch made her jump. The door swung open, and Silas stepped inside, his coat dusted with fresh snow. A fat hair dangled from his belt. He glanced at her, his breath misting in the cold air. "Did you keep the fire?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. He hung his rifle and set about preparing the hair with that same quiet precision. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She couldn't stand it anymore. "Why do you live out here?" she blurted out. He paused his work, the knife still in his hand. He seemed to consider the question, or maybe whether he should even answer it. After a long moment he spoke, his voice low. "Some men belong in towns, with people." He looked up and his eyes met hers. "I don't." The finality in his tone told her not to push, but then, as he looked at her, huddled by the fire, something in his expression seemed to shift. "You're not your father," he said suddenly. The words hung in the air between them. Mara stared at him, stunned. "What?" "The shame he put on you," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. "His shame. That boy's shame. It's not yours to carry." Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Her father had called her a harlot, a disgrace. Calvin had called her nothing at all, just vanished like a ghost. But this man, this silent stranger from the mountains, had just handed her a piece of her own soul back. That night, as she lay on the floor, she could hear him moving in the dark, stoking the fire, his presence a steady, solid thing in the vast, lonely darkness. For the first time since her father had driven her up that frozen trail, a tiny, impossible thought took root in her mind. Maybe she could survive this. But as she stared into the flames, she saw something else glinting in the firelight. On the rough-hewn mantelpiece, tucked behind a bundle of dried herbs, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was beautiful, but that wasn't what made her blood run cold. It was the small silver bell tied around its neck, a bell that was identical to the one on a bracelet Calvin Hargrove had given her, the bracelet she had lost the night she told him she was pregnant. What was it doing here, in this cabin, in the hands of this man? Suddenly, Silas wasn't a stranger. He was a terrifying mystery, and she was trapped in his house, miles from anyone, with a storm brewing not just outside, but right there, in the heart of her cage. The storm hit without warning. It rolled over the mountains like a monstrous living beast, and the world outside the cabin dissolved into a howling vortex of white. Mara woke to the sound of the wind battering the walls, the entire structure groaning under the strain. The air was colder, sharper. She knew, with a primal certainty, that they were trapped. Silas was already awake, a dark silhouette against the roaring fire he was building in the hearth. He moved with that same deliberate calm, a man who didn't fight the mountain, but simply endured it. When Mara sat up, clutching a thin blanket, he glanced at her. "Storm's going to hold us here," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the howl of the wind. 5 days, maybe more. Mara swallowed, the fear a hard knot in her stomach. Being trapped was one thing. Being trapped with a man who had a piece of her past sitting on his mantelpiece was another thing entirely. That tiny silver bell haunted her. "Will we have enough food?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll make do," he replied, gesturing to the corner where a few smoked hares hung. "Seen worse winters." His gaze fell again to her stomach, and she felt that familiar flutter, a tiny kick from the baby. It was a reminder of her secret, the life she was protecting. And now she had another secret, the knowledge of that silver bell, a secret she had to keep from him until she could figure out what it meant. The day wore on, the storm raging with a terrifying fury. Snow piled up against the walls, blocking the windows, plunging the cabin into a dim, fire-lit twilight. Silas sealed the shutters, and the world outside ceased to exist. They were locked in this small wooden box together. She tried to stay busy, to act normal. But every time she looked at him, she saw the question hanging in the air. Who are you? At one point, while she was clumsily chopping vegetables, the knife slipped, nicking her finger. She let out a small gasp, more from the shock of her own wandering thoughts than the pain. In an instant, Silas was there. He crossed the cabin, his brow furrowed with something that looked like concern. He took her hand, inspecting the small cut. His touch was so unexpectedly gentle it caught her off guard. "You've never worked a blade before, have you?" he observed. Mara shook her head, embarrassed, snatching her hand back. "My mother. She did the cooking. My father said I ruined things." A muscle in Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing about her father. Instead, he simply tore a strip of clean cloth and wrapped her finger, his rough hands surprisingly deft. "You'll learn," he said, and as he turned back to his own work, she saw it again. The carved bird on the mantel, the silver bell. Her mind raced, trying to piece it together. Calvin must have dropped it. Maybe he'd come up here hunting. Maybe he knew Silas, or maybe it was something much worse. That night, the storm was a living monster, clawing at the cabin. Mara couldn't sleep. The shadows thrown by the fire seemed to twist into menacing shapes. She turned and saw Silas sitting at the table, sharpening his long hunting knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His face was half hidden in shadow, but his eyes were alert, constantly scanning the small room, as if he were guarding against an unseen threat. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the roar of the wind. He looked up, and for a second, she thought she saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes. Pain. "Lonely's safer," he said, his voice gruff. "People bring trouble. Noise. Lies." Mara stared into the fire. "I didn't mean to bring you trouble." "You didn't," he said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle. "The trouble belongs to the men who hurt you, not you." The words were a comfort and a terror all at once. He was protecting her. But from what? From whom? Was it just the wilderness? Or was it from the very people she'd been running from? The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of storm and silence. They rationed the food, the meals getting thinner and thinner. Silas would venture out only to the edge of the porch to gather snow for water, returning crusted in ice, a mythical beast returning to its lair. He spent his hours carving. Not just the one bird, she now realized. There were others in various stages of completion, tucked away in a wooden box. Birds, wolves, a fox with its head cocked. Each one was perfect, detailed, alive. "Why do you carve these?" she asked one evening, desperate to break the suffocating silence. He didn't look up from his work. "Keeps my hands busy. Keeps my mind from wandering where it shouldn't." "Wandering where?" she pressed, unable to stop herself. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were dark, haunted pools of memory. "To a time before this," he said. "A time with people." He said the word people like it was a curse. On the fourth day, the storm was at its peak. Mara was weak with hunger and worry. She got up to add a log to the fire, but her foot slipped on a patch of ice that had formed near the door. She went down hard, a sharp, searing pain shooting through her side. A cry escaped her lips, louder than she intended. Silas was at her side in a flash, his hands steadying her, his face a mask of something she had never seen before. It wasn't anger, it was raw, unfiltered fear. "What were you thinking?" His voice was sharp, cracking like a whip. "I told you I'd get the snow." "You were asleep," she stammered, wincing as a wave of pain washed over her. "I didn't want to wake you." A wave of dizziness hit her, and the room started to spin. She felt a strange warmth spreading through her clothes, a terrifying dampness. She looked down. Blood. A dark stain was spreading across the rough fabric of her dress. "Silas," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Something's wrong." His gaze followed hers, and the color drained from his face. The baby. It was too soon, far too soon. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, his powerful arms trembling slightly as he carried her to the cot. "It's the baby," he said, his voice tight with an urgency that terrified her. "It's coming." He wasn't just a hermit. He wasn't just a stranger. As he worked with a frantic, desperate focus, tearing strips of cloth, boiling water, his movements were too sure, too knowledgeable. This wasn't the first time he'd done this, and as he knelt beside her, his face grim in the firelight, she finally understood. He hadn't been surprised by her father showing up. He hadn't been surprised that she was pregnant. He had been waiting for her. The next few hours were a nightmare of fire and blood and pain. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, to the roar of the storm outside and the storm raging inside her body. The contractions came one on top of another, relentless waves trying to tear her apart. Through it all, Silas was a rock, a steady, commanding presence in the chaos. He wasn't just helping, he knew exactly what he was doing. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, telling her when to breathe, when to push. His hands, though rough and calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he checked the baby's progress. This wasn't guesswork. This was experience. "Where did you learn this?" she gasped between waves of agony. His face was a grim mask in the firelight. "My wife," he said, his voice tight. "Her name was Alara. The baby came early, during a storm just like this one. He didn't need to say the rest. The haunted look in his eyes told her everything. He had lost them, both of them, right here in this very cabin. The knowledge hit her with the force of a physical blow. This place wasn't just his home, it was a tomb, a monument to his failure. And now, history was repeating itself. "You're stronger than she was," he murmured, his voice thick with a pain that was a decade old. "You have to be. For the baby. Fight, Mara, you have to fight." His desperation fueled her own. She pushed with a strength she didn't know she possessed, a primal scream tearing from her throat, mingling with the howl of the wind. And then, finally, a different cry echoed in the small cabin, a tiny, fragile, perfect cry. Silas caught the baby, his movements swift and sure. He wrapped the tiny, slippery form in a piece of clean flannel, his massive hands trembling. "A girl," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You have a daughter." He placed the baby in her arms and Mara sobbed, tears of relief and exhaustion and pure, unadulterated joy streaming down her face. The baby was so small, her skin flushed, her tiny fists curled tight. She was alive. She was perfect. "Hope," Mara whispered, pressing her cheek against the baby's warm head. "Her name is Hope." Silas crouched by the cot, his gaze fixed on the tiny infant. The tough, unbreakable mountain man was gone. In his place was someone raw, vulnerable, and utterly captivated. "Hope," he repeated, the word a prayer on his lips. "It suits her." He had saved them. He had faced down the ghosts of his past to deliver her future into her arms. But as she looked at him, at the profound sadness that still lingered in his eyes, she realized the truth was far more complicated. His past wasn't just a memory. It was a chain, and that chain was connected directly to the silver bell on his mantelpiece. The days that followed were tender and exhausting. Mara recovered slowly, her body weak but her spirit soaring. Hope was a tiny miracle, a beacon of light in the dark cabin. Silas was surprisingly gentle with the baby. He crafted a small cradle, lining it with the softest rabbit fur. When Hope cried, he would hold her, his large, awkward hands rocking her with a tenderness that made Mara's heart ache. But the mystery remained, a silent guest in their small, makeshift family. One evening, while Silas was outside, Mara's curiosity finally won. Her hands trembling, she reached up and took the small, carved bird from the mantel. The silver bell tinkled softly. She untied it, her fingers fumbling. She knew she shouldn't, but she had to know. Tucked inside the hollowed-out bird was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. It wasn't a note. It was a drawing, a crude but unmistakable map. It showed the ridge, the cabin, and a path leading down to a creek. And at the creek, a small X was marked, with a single word written beside it. Hargrove. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a lost trinket. This was a message, a marker. This cabin, this man, this mountain, it was all connected to the very people who had ruined her life. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Silas stood there, his face a dark silhouette against the falling snow. His eyes weren't on her. They were fixed on the tiny piece of paper in her hand. The gentle, grieving man was gone. In his place was the silent, dangerous stranger from the first night. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The air crackled with tension. The fragile peace they had built shattered into a million pieces. She wasn't his guest. She wasn't a survivor he had rescued. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. A game that had been going on long before she arrived. And she had just stumbled upon the one secret he would do anything to protect. The cabin, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap closing in around her. Silas took a step into the room, the door swinging shut behind him, plunging them into the intimate glow of the firelight. His face was a mask of cold fury. "That is not your concern," he said, his voice dangerously low. He held out his hand. Give it to me. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to obey, to shove the map back into his hand and pretend she'd seen nothing. But the sight of Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, so small and vulnerable, ignited a fire in her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her daughter's future. "No," she said, her own voice surprising her with its strength. "It is my concern. That's my name on that map. The name of the man who did this to me." She clutched the paper tighter. "What does it mean, Silas? Why do you have this? Who are you?" He took another step closer, his shadow engulfing her. "I'm the man who saved your life. That should be enough for you." "It's not," she shot back, standing her ground. "Not when my daughter's life could be at risk. Tell me the truth." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "The truth?" He ran a hand through his matted hair, the picture of a man pushed to the edge. "The truth is a poison in these mountains, girl. It gets people killed. My wife, my Alara, she died because of that name, because of the Hargroves." The confession hung in the air, heavy and dark. "What did they do?" Mara whispered, her anger giving way to a dawning horror. Silas stared into the fire, his eyes seeing a past she could only imagine. "I worked for them, years ago. Old man Hargrove, Calvin's father. I was his foreman, best tracker and builder in the county." His jaw clenched. "They owned everything, but they wanted more. They wanted the land north of the creek, my land, my wife's family land. It had been in her family for generations." He paused, the pain in his voice so raw it was a physical thing. "I refused to sell. So, Hargrove sent men, not to talk. They set a fire, a distraction. While I was fighting it, they came for my wife. They thought she would know where the deed was hidden. She fought them." His voice broke. "She was with child like you. The stress, the fall, it brought the baby on too early." He finally looked at Mara, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it stole her breath. "I found her hours later, too late. The baby was gone. She died in my arms before the sun came up." The story was a punch to the gut. The silver bell. It wasn't Calvin's. It was his wife's. A memento of a life stolen from him. "I'm so sorry," Mara whispered, the words feeling pitifully small. "Sorry doesn't bring them back," he snarled, his grief twisting back into rage. "I went after them. I caught one of the men. Before I—" He trailed off, leaving the dark deed to her imagination. He confessed it was Hargrove's orders, but the sheriff— He was on Hargrove's payroll then, just like he is now. There was no justice to be had, just a rich man's word against a dead woman's. He pointed a shaky finger at the map in her hand. "So I vanished. I came up here, where they couldn't find me. I watched them. I learned their routines. I waited for my chance to get what they took from me. Not the land, justice. The deed is the proof. The proof that the foundation of their entire empire is built on my wife's grave." Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Her father, the sack of feed, the desperate journey up the mountain. "My father," Mara breathed. "Did he know?" Silas nodded slowly. "Your father and I, we grew up together. He knew what Hargrove did to me, when his own daughter fell into the same trap, with Hargrove's son." He let out a long, weary sigh. "He was a coward, ruled by shame. But he wasn't heartless. He couldn't protect you in town, not from them. So he brought you to the one person he knew hated the Hargroves more than he feared them. He brought you to me." The abandonment wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was a desperate, last-ditch act of protection, a twisted, broken kind of love. Before she could process this new, earth-shattering revelation, a sound from outside cut through the night. The frantic crunching of footsteps in the snow, coming fast. Silas grabbed his rifle, his body instantly shifting from grieving widower to hardened protector. He moved to the door, peering through a tiny crack. "Who is it?" Mara whispered, clutching Hope tighter. The door burst open, and her younger brother Ethan stumbled inside, his face pale with terror and exhaustion. He was covered in snow, shivering violently. "Ethan!" Mara gasped, rushing to him. What are you doing here? How did you find us? Mara, you have to come home, he panted, his words tumbling out in a rush. It's Mama. After you left, Papa just broke. He left, just walked away. And Mama, she got sick. The worry, it's eating her alive. The doctor says she doesn't have long. The world tilted on its axis. Her mother, the one gentle soul in her life, fading away because of her. I have to go to her, Mara said, turning to Silas, her eyes pleading. You can't, Silas said firmly, his gaze dropping to Hope. The baby's too small. The journey would kill her, and you're not strong enough yet. Then I'll go alone. You can keep Hope here. The words tore from her, a desperate, impossible bargain. Ethan grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with fear. That's not all, Mara. That's not why I came. Hargrove's men. They're looking for you. Not to scare you. They're saying Calvin wants his heir. They're coming for the baby. The air left Mara's lungs. It wasn't about shame anymore. It wasn't about silencing her. Calvin didn't want to bury his mistake. He wanted to claim it. Hope wasn't a disgrace to be hidden. She was an asset to be seized. And they were trapped on the mountain, with the storm finally breaking and an army on its way. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Calvin Hargrove, the boy who had whispered sweet promises and then vanished, didn't just want to erase her. He wanted her child. Hope wasn't a symbol of shame. She was a prize, an heir to the very empire built on theft and murder. No, Mara whispered, her arms tightening around the sleeping infant. He will never touch her. Silas's face was grim, his eyes scanning the tree line outside as if he could already see the enemy approaching. He knows the baby is his only link to the Ellison land, your family's land, the peace they could never get. He thinks an heir will solidify his claim. My family's land? Mara asked, confused. We have a small farm, nothing more. More than you know, Silas said, his voice low and urgent. Your great-grandfather owned half this valley. He lost most of it, but he held on to the deed for the north quarter, the same land my wife's family owned. The Hargroves have been trying to get their hands on it for 50 years. Your father never told you because he was afraid. He knew what they were capable of. Her entire life was a lie, constructed to keep her ignorant and safe. And now, that ignorance had led the wolf right to her door. We can't stay here, Ethan said, his voice trembling. They'll find us. Running is what they expect, Silas countered, his mind already working, calculating. They know the mountain, but I know it better. We don't run. We fight. He looked from Mara to Ethan, his gaze hard as iron. But not here. This cabin is a trap. He moved with a sudden, desperate energy, grabbing blankets, the last of the dried meat, and stuffing them into a leather pack. Your mother, he said to Mara. I'll go get her. You and Ethan take Hope and go to the old trapper's line. It's a series of small, hidden shelters. I'll meet you at the third one, the one by the frozen waterfall. You'll be safe there. You're going to get my mother? Mara asked, stunned. She deserves to see her grandchild, and you deserve to say goodbye, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He grabbed Ethan by the shoulder. You'll go with your sister. Protect her. Do you understand? Ethan nodded, his young face set with a new, grim determination. I will. Go now, Silas commanded. Follow the creek bed west. Don't stop until you reach the waterfall. And don't light a fire unless you have to. Mara hesitated, her heart torn in a million directions. Leaving him felt wrong. Trusting him felt like the only option she had. She looked at him, at this man who was a stranger only weeks ago, who was now risking everything for her family. Silas, she began. Go, he said again, his voice softer this time. Keep her safe. That's all that matters. The journey through the woods was a waking nightmare. Every snap of a twig, every shadow felt like a threat. Ethan led the way, his fear replaced by a fierce, protective focus. Mara followed, hope strapped to her chest, the tiny weight a constant, terrifying reminder of what was at stake. The trapper's shelter was little more than a lean-to dug into the side of a rock face, barely big enough for the three of them. It was cold, damp, but it was hidden. They huddled together for warmth, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting. Hours stretched into an eternity. Doubt began to creep in. What if Silas didn't make it? What if Hargrove's men found him? What if they were all just waiting here to die? Just as the last light of day was fading, they heard a sound, a soft whistle, a signal they had agreed upon. Ethan scrambled to the entrance. A moment later, Silas appeared, his face etched with exhaustion, and behind him, supported by his strong arm, was Mara's mother. Clara Ellison was a ghost of her former self, her skin pale, her breath shallow. But when her eyes landed on Mara and on the baby, a light flickered in them. "My girl," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling. Mara rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she helped her mother into the tiny shelter. "Mama, I'm so sorry." "Hush now," Clara said, her trembling hand reaching out to touch Hope's cheek. "You have nothing to be sorry for." She looked from Mara to Silas, a knowing, tired smile on her face. "Your father, he did one right thing in the end. He sent you to the only man in these mountains with a soul strong enough to stand against the darkness." She coughed, a racking, painful sound. "Mara, listen to me. There's something you need to know. The deed, the one Silas is looking for. It's not just a proof of ownership." "What do you mean?" Mara asked, leaning closer. "It contains a clause," her mother whispered, her voice fading. "A penalty clause. If the Hargrove family was ever found to have acquired their lands through illegal means, their entire fortune, every acre, every dollar, it forfeits, not to the state, to the direct descendants of the original landowners." Mara's blood ran cold. She looked at Silas, whose eyes were wide with a shock that mirrored her own. "My wife's family, and yours," Silas breathed. "Yes," Clara confirmed. "The deed doesn't just give you justice, Silas. It gives you everything." Her eyes found Mara's, and that means Hope, your daughter. She is not just an heir to a small piece of land. She is the rightful heir to the entire Hargrove Empire. The secret was out, a secret worth killing for, a secret that turned Hope from a pawn into a queen. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the darkness outside the shelter, sharp and cruel. "Well, well, I knew you were hiding something, Crowell, but I never imagined it would be this good." Silas spun around, raising his rifle, framed in the entrance to the shelter, holding a lantern that cast a demonic glow on his face, was Sheriff Bram. And behind him stood Calvin Hargrove, his handsome face twisted into a greedy, triumphant sneer. "Thank you for the family reunion," the sheriff said, his pistol aimed directly at Silas's chest. "Now, hand over the baby. And the deed. The game is over." The shelter, their last hope for sanctuary, had become a cage. Sheriff Bram stood there, his gun steady, the friendly mask he'd worn before completely gone, replaced by the cold, hard face of a traitor. "Bram, you snake," Silas growled, his own rifle still aimed, the two men locked in a deadly standoff. "Business is business, Crowell," the sheriff said with a shrug. "And the Hargroves have always paid better than the law." Calvin stepped forward, his eyes, those same eyes that had once looked at Mara with feigned adoration, were now fixed on Hope with a chilling, possessive hunger. "Give her to me, Mara. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She is my daughter, my heir." "She is nothing to you," Mara spat, shielding Hope with her body. "You left us. You left me." "A necessary and, it turns out, temporary inconvenience," Calvin said with a dismissive wave. "We knew your father would run to Crowell. We've been waiting for him to lead us to the deed for years. You and the baby just sped things up, brought all the key players to one location. It's wonderfully efficient. The whole thing had been a setup. From the very beginning. Her father's fear, her flight to Silas, Bram's rescue. It was all a long, elaborate trap to get the two things they wanted most, the deed and the heir." Clara, Mara's mother, coughed weakly from the corner, but her eyes burned with a fierce light. You will not win, Calvin, she rasped. A house built on lies cannot stand. Calvin laughed, a cold, ugly sound. This house has been standing for 50 years, old woman, and with my daughter and that deed, it will stand for 50 more. He gestured with his chin to Bram. Get the kid, Sheriff. Bram took a step forward. In that split second, Silas made his move. He didn't fire at Bram. He fired at the lantern in Calvin's hand. The shot was perfect. The lantern exploded, plunging the entrance into absolute darkness. Glass shattered, and Calvin screamed as hot oil splashed onto his hand. Now! Silas roared. He tackled Bram, the two men crashing to the ground in a desperate struggle. Ethan, the back way! Go! Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mara's hand, pulling her toward a small, hidden fissure in the back of the rock face, a tiny escape route Silas must have known about. Come on, Mara! Mara scrambled after him, her heart pounding, her mother's weak cries echoing behind her. She could hear the grunts and curses of the fight, the terrifying sound of fists hitting flesh. She risked one look back. In the flickering, dying light of the broken lantern, she saw Silas drive his knife into Bram's side. The sheriff went down with a gurgling cry. But as Silas rose, two more of Hargrove's men appeared at the entrance, blocking his escape, their guns raised. He was trapped, sacrificing himself to give them a chance. Don't look back! Ethan yelled, pulling her through the narrow gap in the rock. They emerged into the cold night air, the forest dark and terrifying around them. We have to go! It's what he wanted! Tears streamed down Mara's face as she ran, stumbling through the snow, clutching hope to her chest. The sounds of the fight faded behind them, replaced by the thumping of her own terrified heart. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs gave out. They found a small overhang, a hollow beneath the roots of an ancient pine, and collapsed, huddling together for warmth, the silence of the forest pressing in. Hope began to cry, her small wails cutting through the night. Mara rocked her, whispering reassurances she didn't feel, her mind reeling. Her mother, Silas. Were they dead? Had their sacrifice been for nothing? Suddenly Ethan grabbed her arm, his eyes wide. Listen, he whispered. Through the trees they could hear voices. Hargrove's men. They were searching, spreading out, combing the forest for them. A beam of a lantern cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth, getting closer. They were going to be found. It was only a matter of time. Mara looked down at her daughter, at her innocent, sleeping face, the rightful heir to a fortune and the target of a manhunt. She thought of Silas, of his courage. She thought of her mother, of her last defiant words. A house built on lies cannot stand. She knew what she had to do. It was a wild, desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. Ethan, she whispered, her voice steady now, filled with a cold, hard resolve. We're not going to run anymore. We're going to end this. Tonight. She looked up, her eyes locking with her brother's. I know where the deed is. Ethan stared at her. How? Mama told me, Mara said, a memory surfacing, a story her mother had told her as a little girl, a story that she'd thought was just a fairy tale. She didn't tell me what it was, but she told me where Papa hid their most precious things. It's not in the cabin. It's not on the mountain. The lantern beams were getting closer, the voices louder. Where is it? Ethan pressed. It's at the farm, Mara whispered, hidden in plain sight, in the one place no one would ever think to look. A new plan formed in her mind, a plan so audacious, so dangerous, it could get them all killed. But it was better than cowering in the dark, waiting for the end. They wouldn't just survive, they would take back what was stolen. They think we're trapped up here, she said, a grim smile touching her lips. But they're wrong. They're looking in the wrong place. She stood up, her small frame filled with a strength she didn't know she had. Let's go home. Using the search party's noise as cover, they moved in the opposite direction, circling back towards the path that led down the mountain. It was a grueling, terrifying journey in the dark. But Mara's new purpose gave her strength. She was no longer the abandoned girl. She was a mother fighting for her child's life. She was a daughter seeking justice for her family. As they reached the base of the mountain trail, they saw it. Their old farmhouse, dark and silent under the moonlight. It looked smaller, sadder than she remembered. But it was home, and it held the key to everything. "The hearth," Mara whispered to Ethan as they crept across the frozen fields. "Mama said Papa built a false stone into the back of the hearth. Behind it is a small compartment. That's where he kept her wedding ring after she died, and that's where he hid the deed." They slipped in through the back, the house eerily silent. It felt like a tomb. They moved to the main room, to the large stone fireplace that had been the heart of their home for generations. Mara ran her hands over the cool stones at the back, feeling for a loose one. Her fingers found it, a stone that shifted slightly under pressure. With Ethan's help, she pried it loose, and there in the dark cavity behind it was a small oilskin-wrapped package. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was not just one deed, but two. One was the original, ancient deed for the Ellison and Crowell lands, with the damning penalty clause written in elegant, faded script. The other was a more recent document. It was a confession. A signed, notarized confession from one of the men who had attacked Silas's wife, written years ago. The man, dying and seeking to clear his conscience, had detailed the entire crime, implicating Old Man Hargrove, Calvin, and Sheriff Bram. Her father must have tracked the man down and convinced him to write it. This was it, the proof, the weapon that could bring the entire Hargrove empire crashing down. Suddenly, the front door burst open. Calvin Hargrove stood there, his face contorted in a mask of rage, his hand bandaged from the lantern blast. A few of his men flanked him, their guns raised. "Looking for this?" Mara said, holding up the deeds. Calvin's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face before being replaced by fury. "You're clever, I'll give you that, but you're still a foolish little girl. Did you really think you could get away?" "I'm not trying to get away, Calvin," Mara said, her voice ringing with newfound power in the silent house. "I'm here to make a trade." Calvin laughed. "You have nothing to trade. I'll take the papers, and I'll take my daughter." "You'll get neither," a voice growled from the darkness behind him. Everyone spun around. Leaning against the door frame, bloodied and bruised but very much alive, was Silas. His rifle was steady in his hands, aimed directly at Calvin's head. "The sheriff's men are dead," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, "and Bram won't be bothering anyone ever again. It's just you now, Hargrove." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Calvin's men looked nervously from Silas to their boss. Their numbers were no longer an advantage, but Calvin wasn't done. He was a cornered rat, and that made him even more dangerous. He lunged, not at Silas, but at Mara. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him, a human shield. He pressed a small pistol to her temple. "Drop it, Crowell!" he screamed, his voice high and panicked. "Or she dies, and the baby with her!" The standoff was absolute. Silas couldn't shoot without hitting Mara. Ethan stood frozen, helpless. Hope, startled by the shouting, began to cry. Mara looked at Silas, her heart breaking. It was all for nothing. They were going to lose. But then she saw it. Over Calvin's shoulder she saw a flicker of movement outside the window, a familiar, hulking shadow detaching itself from the darkness of the barn. It was her father. He hadn't run. He had come back. He held a heavy woodsman's axe in his hands, and on his face was a look of pure, righteous fury. He was no longer a man ruled by shame. He was a father who had finally found his courage. He raised the axe. And in that moment, Mara knew. The house of Hargrove was about to fall. Her father didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that defied his age, a silent wraith of vengeance. Before Calvin's men could even react, he swung the heavy axe, not at a person, but at the main support beam of the porch, right outside the door. The wood splintered with a sickening crack. With a great groaning roar, the entire porch roof collapsed, trapping Calvin's men outside, blocking their path and their line of sight. In that moment of chaos, Mara acted. She drove her elbow back, hard, into Calvin's ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted away, dropping to the floor, clutching the precious deeds. Now it was just Calvin, Silas, and her father in the room. A final, desperate reckoning. "It's over, Calvin," her father said, his voice shaking with a rage that had been buried for years. "You took my daughter's innocence. You tried to steal her child. You will not take anything else from this family." Calvin, his face a mask of disbelief and panic, scrambled for his dropped pistol. But Silas was faster. He brought the butt of his rifle down hard on Calvin's hand, shattering the bones. Calvin screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony and defeat. It was over, truly over. In the days that followed, the truth came out, piece by painful piece. The deeds, the confession, Silas's testimony. It was an avalanche that buried the Hargrove legacy forever. With Sheriff Bram dead and their influence gone, the full weight of the law came down. The Hargrove fortune was frozen, their lands seized. And as the penalty clause of the old deed dictated, everything, every last acre, every dollar, was transferred to its rightful heirs. Hope Ellison and Silas Crowell. The news spread through the county like wildfire. Mara was no longer the shamed girl. She was an icon of resilience, a woman who had faced down a corrupt dynasty and won. Her father, his spirit finally freed from the prison of fear, asked for her forgiveness. Looking at the broken, humbled man before her, Mara gave it freely. The past was a scar, but it no longer had to be an open wound. They returned to the mountain, to the small cabin that had become their sanctuary. It was no longer a place of exile, but a place of peace. With their newfound resources, they could have lived anywhere, in any grand house they wanted. But they chose the simple, solid reality of the life they had built together. One evening, as spring finally melted the last of the snow from the peaks, Mara stood on the porch with Hope on her hip, watching Silas and her father work together, mending the corral fence. Ethan was there too, no longer a boy, but a young man forged into strength by the trials they had faced. Silas walked over, his rough hand gently touching Hope's cheek. He looked at Mara, his dark eyes no longer haunted, but filled with a quiet, profound love. "I spent a decade waiting for justice," he said, his voice soft. "I never realized I was just waiting for you." He pulled the small carved wooden ring from his pocket, the one he had made so long ago, and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They had faced the darkest parts of human nature, greed, cruelty, and betrayal. But they had found the best in each other, courage, sacrifice, and a love that had been tested in fire and had emerged stronger than steel. They had started as a collection of broken people, abandoned and left for dead. But here, on this mountain, under the vast, open sky, they had become a family, whole, healed, and finally, truly free. If you were moved by Mara's incredible story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and let us know in the comments below, what do you think is the true meaning of family?